Gradients can be a fun way to add some visual interest to your journal, especially when it comes to lettering. So in this video, we're going to look at 6 different ways that you can achieve gradient lettering that you can use to make headers that stand out. The first style we have here is probably the simplest, and that's just doing a different color for each of the letters that you're using. This makes a gradient from left to right in the lettering rather than from top to bottom. If you're not that great at brush lettering, like I'm not, you can just use faux to do this, making sure to thicken any downstrokes you have, make the upstrokes thinner. We have a separate video on that on the channel. But here, anytime you finish one letter form, for instance the H moving into the E, you just change which pen you're using. This does mean you don't have seamless blending throughout the different colors, but it is one of the more approachable types of gradient lettering. When I do this type of lettering, I try to make sure that my color transition makes sense. So here, going from red to a reddish orange to a more yellow orange before moving on to yellow. Even in those yellows, I use 2 different types, so I have a more golden yellow sitting next to the orange, and then a more true yellow on the end. Of course, you don't have to use colors that blend as well as these do. You can go with completely different colors, but then you're not going to so much end up with gradient lettering, but more multicolored lettering. It's certainly not necessary to do, but I wanted to add an outline to the lettering, and I also find that this helps to make the transition between colors seem more seamless. Yes, you can still see where one color meets the next, but it doesn't make it quite as obvious when it has an outline, and also when the join between those letters is smaller. As for our next idea, this one is similar, but instead of just keeping it so that each of the letters has a separate color, we're going to intentionally blend where one color meets the next. The easiest way to do this is just start by drawing out each of the letters with separate colors, and then wherever one letter joins the next, go and blend that section using the lighter of the 2 pens. When I went and put this one in, I made it so that anytime the pen turns upwards, like at the end of the H, the end of the E, as we get that smaller section going towards the next letter, I didn't fully color this in with the pen that I'd been using for that letter. So for instance, in terms of the H, where we use that green, I didn't fully color in the upturned end of the H with that green pen. I left a little bit of it open so that I could introduce that new color pen earlier. This gave me an intentional space to blend those 2 colors together, rather than trying to blend it in the majority of the letter itself. You can of course do blending in the larger sections of the letter, but the blending ends up looking a little bit more seamless if you put it in the smaller section, which is why I've done that here. I also tend to try and blend with the lighter color rather than the darker one, because if you lay darker colors over the top of lighter ones, you don't so much get a blending but more of an overpowering of the lighter color. If you're using water-based markers like I'm using here, I'm using the Tombow dual brush markers, by putting down that lighter color on top of the darker one, the lighter color pen ends up picking up a little bit of the color from the darker marker. This means you can kind of smudge that darker color or smear it into the lighter color's letter form. Again, by doing the color per letter here, it means that the blending section doesn't need to be as big. It's usually a little bit easier to make it less noticeable where the blending is, and can be a nice easy way to approach gradient lettering if you're just starting out with it. Most of the time when we're thinking about gradient lettering though, we're not so much thinking from the start to the end of the word, but more from the top to the bottom of the word, which is what the rest of our examples are covering. The one we're starting with here is what I call a top and bottom gradient, so you're starting by coloring in the tops of the letter forms with one color, and then going in with a separate color and coloring in the bottom. I mean, technically speaking, you could use the same color for both, but I think it's a fun opportunity to play around with different color combinations. Here though, rather than bringing those pens to actually meet each other in the middle, we're just sticking to either the very top or the very bottom of the letter forms. Now this can be a little bit tricky if you haven't gone in with pencil first, or what I'm using here is just some printouts of a very light gray, which says hello, mainly so that I could get the letters looking kind of the same for each of the examples. But I would recommend that if you're going to go with this style, go in with pencil first so that you can see where your letters should end up. Otherwise, you kind of have to predict this on the fly, and that can be kind of tricky. Another way you can do it is by adding a very, very light color down first. So writing out your words in full using that very, very pale color, and then going over the top with the colors you're adding for the gradient. As said though, here we want to color in the tops and the bottoms of the letters, and then to get a nice gradient or blended finish, what you can do is use the N00 Tombow pen, which is the white blender marker. It's intentionally included in the packs to do blending. Or what I often like to do is just use a paintbrush with a very small amount of water, especially if you're doing this in your journal. Unless you're using a watercolor journal specifically, adding too much water to your pages can be not so great. can possibly cause some bleeding if you add too much, or just a warping of the pages if you add too much. Here though, we just want to add the smallest amount of water to kind of buff or blend out the edges of the pen colors that we've laid down. I do this really by concentrating my strokes at where the edge of the pen is, but also to make it so that then I don't have any effectively like water staining just at that edge. I'll also do some strokes up into the color and down into the section that I haven't colored in. This is going to work better for some markers over others. You can see that the blue at the bottom that we're blending picks up the color a lot nicer. It means that the gradient we have in that section is probably a little bit more obvious. And it also helps to do this process fairly soon after having put the color down. If you leave it on the paper for too long, actually blending it, making that blending look good is kind of tricky. Oftentimes when people do gradient lettering, they're not necessarily looking to have a white section in the middle, they're more so looking for color from very top to very bottom of the lettering. So our next example is pretty much the easiest version of that, and that's just by using one pen to do your gradient. The nice part about water-based markers is that as you layer them over the top of each other, you get a deepening or a darkening of the color, and we're using that to our advantage here. The only issue with this style though is that you need to be really mindful when putting your lettering down, that you don't want to go over with the pen too much at the top of the letter forms. If you're not so good at brush lettering, like me, then you do need to be very mindful of this. Try and make sure that you're not concentrating too much of that pen work at the top as you go and round out things and smooth things off. This is again where having a pencil sketch or some kind of guideline can be really helpful, just to make sure that you don't double up or go over sections of your pen where you don't want them to. Once you've written in your words though, just using that one layer of your pen work, then we want to go and darken the lower or top section of your letter forms. I typically tend to do the darker section at the bottom, so from about the midway point of each letter, I'm laying down another stroke of the same marker. Anywhere I'm going over twice with the marker is going to darken up, and I can usually get 3 to 4 different sections by doing this technique. So going over with the pen once, going over again to make it twice, doing another pass over for 3, and of course another for 4. After this though, I find that you don't really add any darkness, but you will possibly bleed through your pages. This style of gradient lettering where we're going over with the same pen repeatedly can cause bleed through if you're not careful, so make sure to test this out in the back of your journal before you try it on the pages that you're wanting the finished product on. Once you've done the second pass over though, you can go in with a third, maybe doing this from about a quarter of the way up the letter form, and once that's done and dried, you can do the same thing with a fourth pass over, just at the very bottom of the letters. The nice part about this style though is that you only need one brush pen to do it. It also means that in terms of getting a gradient that's all in the same color family, you don't have to go hunting for different color matches or anything like that, so it can make it very approachable and still visually effective. If you wanted a bit more depth on that gradient though, you really wanted to have some very light colors and some very dark colors, then doing our fifth option is probably better. This is where we use the same hue, so like the same color, I've gone with blue, but used multiple pens to achieve the gradient. Here I'll start by going in with the lightest color, either writing out the full words, especially if I'm not using a guide like I am in this video, or you can do similar to what we did in the top bottom gradient and just color in the top of the words. Here it's totally okay to go and write in the full letter forms though, because we're going to be laying additional colors over the top of this lightest one. And because anything we lay over the top is going to be darker, it's fully okay to write them in full using the palest color. Once you've got the letter forms down with the palest color though, then it's time to go in with the next step in your gradient, or in my case a mid-tone blue. Here I'm going through each of the letter forms and coloring in the middle section, making sure to leave a section at the top which is paler, and also leaving the bottom paler as well. You can color all the way down if you want to, but we're going to be going over that section with a darker pen, so it's not super necessary. Also, if you're trying to avoid bleeding in your journal, then going over with pen multiple times isn't ideal, so we can safeguard ourselves against that by not touching those bottom sections at this stage. When I come through with this medium tone pen, I'm trying to make it so that I don't leave a straight line of color going through the letter form. This is very much a personal choice. I like to make the section where the mid-tone meets the lightest tone a little bit jagged, and this just helps me to make the blended section a little bit more blended, I suppose. We're gonna go back in later and make that blending a little bit more seamless, but for now we just want to get that mid-tone blue in there. Once the mid-tone is done though, then it's on to the darker tone. I'm using 3 different pens here, so a pale blue, a mid-blue, and a dark blue, and notably that dark blue is going along the bottom. We want to make sure to leave some of that mid-tone blue visible, otherwise you're just going to put down dark blue right next to light blue, and then you won't get very good blending. And I'm going to concentrate where that dark blue is at the bottom of each of the letters. Again, I try to use a jagged line where I'm meeting that mid and dark blue together, just so it makes my blending a little bit easier. And you could leave it where it is at the end of this stage, just going in with those 3 pens once. But what I like to do is go in and improve my blending a bit, effectively by working backwards with the pens. So now as I've got the darkest color down, I'll bring that mid-tone blue back to blend the area between the mid and the darkest blue. This is just done by rubbing my pen up and down along where those 2 lines meet. This not only darkens the mid-tone blue, like it would have in the 1 pen gradient we did before, but it also helps to pick up some of that darker blue color and blend that into the section as well. I'll then do the same thing using the lightest tone blue, blending in the section between the mid-tone blue and the light blue. Depending on what pens you use in this, you can get a very seamless transition, especially if you're using quite a range of pens. I only went with 3 for this because that's really all that's necessary to get a really nice transition from pale to dark blue. But you could go with 4 colors or 5, especially if you want to make that blending very, very seamless. Of course, blending with water-based markers on regular paper like this, which is just like cartridge paper from a printer, isn't as easy to do. You can of course get better blending if you're using alcohol markers and stuff like that, but alcohol markers usually aren't the easiest things to use in our journals because they have a tendency to bleed, and most people don't want bleeding. This is the style that I probably use the most often when it comes to my gradient lettering, but maybe you don't want to just stick with one color, possibly you want multiple, and this is where we can use multiple hues or multiple colors, and because of that we naturally have to use multiple pens. While in the last option we could write out the letter forms in full using the lightest color, I don't encourage that here because oftentimes if you're using multiple hues you don't really want to muddy your colors by going down with whatever the lightest option is first. In this example, if I had have gone down with the yellow first, it means that any of my blue sections would be green, my purple section would look a little bit brown, and my pink section would look a lot more orange. That's not really what I'm going for here. I want to make a rainbow. Where you start in this letter form is completely up to you. I just have a tendency to start from the top and work to the bottom, but you could go and try and lay down the lightest color first if you wanted to. It can just be a little bit hard to predict where that's going to be. For me, the lightest color, yellow, is going to be in the middle of the letter form, and I wasn't really too sure where it was going to end up, so I just worked from pink through to orange, yellow, so on and so forth. Here we're again trying to do the same thing though, so leaving an edge that's a little bit more jagged so that when we bring those colors together we can blend them a little bit easier. And as we go and add the color down, because we are using fully separate colors, you can see that those edges coming together and touching, they don't look particularly blended. So we're gonna have to do some additional blending at the end. Now we could again use the lighter of the 2 pen colors. So for instance, where orange and yellow meet, I could go in with the yellow. Where blue and green meet, whichever hue ends up being a little bit lighter, I could use that one. But I decided to go in again with my paintbrush and just use a very small amount of water to blend those out. When you're blending colors that are distinctly different, again, it can be very beneficial to go in with that water pretty much as soon as possible so that you have a little bit more opportunity to move the color around. I didn't really do that in this case, so I did have to add a little bit more water. And if you get up close and personal with the lettering, you can see that it isn't blended as well as it could be. But when you're just using your journal normally, with the size of lettering that I'm using and the extent of blending, I think it looks really good. Of course, in terms of the lettering we're doing in this video, we're really focusing on the gradients, but with the letter style I've used, you could go over the top and add some more pattern works or add some decoration that's additional. One thing in particular that I like to do with this style of lettering would be adding a drop shadow and maybe a little highlight with a white gel pen, just so it makes it look a little bit more 3D or like bubble lettering. It's also worth noting that gradient lettering can take some time, both to master and then to actually execute in your journal, but if you're willing to put in the time and effort, it can be really visually impactful and a fun, creative way to add some interest to your journal. If you are looking for more lettering ideas though, then the playlist we have here is the next one to check out. That one has all of our lettering videos, including different styles, different techniques, and it's worth checking out. So click or tap on that one and I'll see you over there.